Teren should have reported the gesture immediately. Protocol left no room for interpretation on that point. Any unexplained synchronization during a first-rank diplomatic ceremony, especially one occurring within seconds of an anomalous orbital reading, belonged in the security channel before the applause had even faded. Instead, he remained beneath the crystal dome with his tablet dark in his hand, while the ceremony continued in perfect ceremonial order, as if reality had not just shifted half a degree beneath everyone's feet. The lapse unsettled him at once, not because he was careless, but because he was not. His career existed because he noticed the wrong things at the right time and refused to call them harmless simply because they were small. Humanity's welcome concluded without incident. Provisional corridor access. Cultural exchange standing. A speaking seat in the Outer Coalition Council pending final defense review. Generous terms by any standard, almost suspiciously generous, and the human delegation accepted them with gratitude polished enough to please the chamber without ever feeling rehearsed. Ambassador Elara Thorne spoke of trust, distance, and the bad habit civilizations had of meeting one another through fear before language. Her voice was steady, warm, persuasive in a way that made agreement feel intelligent rather than emotional. The hall approved. Several longtime skeptics softened. Even Sarat, who collected disappointments the way others collected titles, inclined her head with visible respect. That should have settled Teren's concern. Instead, it made the unease sharper, cleaner, harder to dismiss. He had expected relief from a species standing at the edge of admission. Relief had a pattern. It loosened the shoulders, changed breathing. It emptied tension from the hands. The humans showed none of it. They were pleased, yes, but not surprised. They looked like people watching an expected result arrive on schedule. By custom, the delegates moved to the inner observatory, where the sanctuary glass opened over the storm-scarred planet below and diplomacy shed its formal skin. This was where reputations were tested for weakness, where compliments concealed probing, where a careless glance could undo an hour of perfect speeches. Teren preferred receptions to assemblies. Public sessions were performance. Private mingling was anatomy. He noticed the human attaché before the attaché officially noticed him, which later felt less like observation than participation in someone else's timing. Jonah Mercer, according to the summit slate, cultural liaison, archive specialist, secondary translator. He stood at the edge of a circle of alien delegates explaining why humans kept physical books long after data storage had become effortless. He spoke lightly, almost playfully, yet everyone around him leaned closer as if he had altered the gravity of the conversation by a fraction. Then he produced a small paper notebook from inside his formal coat and passed it around the circle. Curiosity became laughter. Laughter became comfort. Comfort became lowered guard. Mercer had done it in under a minute. When the others drifted away, his gaze reached Teren through the observatory glass before his body turned. "You're the one who noticed," he said softly, as if continuing a conversation they had not yet begun. Teren felt the cold arrive then, not from the room, but from the precision of the sentence. "Noticed what?" Mercer's expression remained easy, almost amused, but something behind it locked into place. "That?" he said, and at that exact moment the eastern glass shivered with a faint diagnostic ripple. Across the reflection, 3 human delegates looked up together. Not at the glass, at the sky beyond it. Teren did not move for several seconds after the ripple faded. Around him the observatory resumed its soft circulation of voices, glassware, and diplomatic half-truths, but the moment had already split itself away from the evening and begun hardening into fact. Most of the room had ignored the disturbance entirely. A few guests glanced toward the dome, dismissed it as a system fluctuation, and returned to the far more comfortable work of being impressed by one another. The humans had not done that. They had oriented. That difference mattered. It mattered enough that Teren abandoned subtlety and followed Mercer the instant the attaché turned away from the rail. Mercer did not head toward his own delegation. He moved through the reception in a pattern that only became visible if one was looking for a pattern at all. He entered one conversation just long enough to be seen in it, redirected a junior diplomat with a hand gesture so light it could still be mistaken for courtesy, then crossed to the far side of the chamber by way of reflective surfaces instead of direct lines. By the time Teren caught up near the western colonnade, every human in the observatory occupied a position that offered sightlines to at least 2 exits and a mirrored angle on the rest of the room. None of them were armed. None of them were clustered. None of them looked alarmed. They looked prepared in the specific way people did when they had already finished the argument about whether preparation was necessary. "You knew that Ripple was coming," Teren said. Mercer turned with an ease that might have passed for innocence in anyone else. "I suspected something would confirm itself soon." "That is not a denial." "No," Mercer said. "It isn't." The honesty destabilized Teren more than deflection would have. "Then explain." Mercer studied him for a second, and some of the warmth thinned without disappearing. "If I explain too early, you'll think I'm manipulating you. If I explain too late, you'll think I used you. I'm trying to select the version where you resent me least. My resentment is not your operational concern." "It may become one," Mercer said. A sanctuary chime interrupted them. Not the melodic sequence used for honors or transitions. This one was shorter, flatter, administrative. Several delegates paused. The service staff did not, which meant the message had gone only to cleared personnel. Teren's tablet lit in his hand with a notice from lower systems control. "Temporary sensor recalibration in progress. No action required. Maintain summit continuity." Mercer glanced at the screen and exhaled through his nose. "There it is." "There what is?" "The first lie phrased as maintenance." Teren stared at him. "You expected this." "I expected a decision to be made," Mercer said. "Now it has." That answer carried more than it said. Teren had spent long years around covert reviews, redacted failures, and the soft bureaucratic language states used when panic had to be delayed. Mercer was saying only what he could afford to say, and the care in that restraint implied stakes much larger than diplomatic embarrassment. Teren slid the tablet into silent trace mode and began routing archive requests through behavioral access while keeping his eyes on the human. "You're telling me the sanctuary is compromised." "I'm telling you," Mercer said, "that if this were merely compromise, tonight would be considerably easier. That should have been enough. Teren should have triggered security override, forced an internal seal, and accepted whatever consequences followed. Instead, he did what experienced analysts often did when reality became more dangerous than procedure. He sought context at speed. Who else knows? Mercer's gaze shifted briefly toward Ambassador Thorne, who stood near the eastern glass in quiet conversation with 2 coalition ministers. She looked composed, gracious, fully engaged in post-vote diplomacy. She also occupied a position from which she could see the main corridor, the service alcoves, and Mercer's reflection in the curved glass behind Teren. "Enough of us," Mercer said. "To avoid dying stupidly." The sentence was so plain that it stripped the remaining elegance from the room. Teren's archive requests began returning in fragments. Lower sensor spine logs had been amended twice in the last 11 minutes. Initial anomaly records were sealed under Summit Continuity Authority. That alone was extraordinary. Technical data did not vanish upward unless someone feared interpretation more than malfunction. He pushed harder, piggybacking through cross-species stability credentials that granted limited priority during active summit irregularities. The system resisted for a fraction of a second, then yielded partial telemetry. Deep field mass echo unresolved. Vector non-stationary. Signature profile shield muted. Estimated object count redacted. Not singular. Count. The observatory suddenly felt too beautiful to be safe. Teren lowered the tablet. "How long?" Mercer answered without asking what he meant. "Long enough." "How long have they been there?" "Long enough," Mercer repeated. "The only reason you're still asking calm questions is that whoever is out there has not yet decided the quiet part is over." The music in the observatory shifted pieces. Something softer drifted upward from the lower level, a composition designed to imply refinement without demanding attention. Teren found himself hating it. Around them, the reception continued performing stability while hidden mechanisms changed state beneath the floor. He looked again to the humans and saw more than he had seen before. No one held a full glass. No one let trailing fabric drag near the floor. No one turned both shoulders fully away from the room at once. Even their relaxed posture had been simplified by degrees so fine only a trained reader would notice them. Prepared but not tense. Ready but not broadcasting readiness. The discipline of it was what made his pulse rise. They had rehearsed this. The realization brought a second question immediately after it, and the second was worse. Rehearsed for what? Mercer appeared to see the thought form. We prepare for contact events, he said. All kinds. This was supposed to be diplomacy. For you, Mercer said. For us it was diplomacy until it wasn't. We've learned not to let categories make decisions for us. That sentence explained more than perhaps Mercer intended. It implied a species memory of agreements curdling without warning, of peaceful rooms becoming operational spaces in the time it took a system to update. Not paranoia, conditioning, not belligerence. Continuity planning burned so deeply into culture it surfaced in body language before thought. Who are they? Teren asked. Mercer's jaw tightened just slightly. If I answer that without confirmation, I make your next choices worse. That is not your decision. No, Mercer said. But your survivability may be. The words should have angered Teren. Instead they clarified the scale of the room around him. Mercer was not posturing. He was triaging information, deciding what an unprepared ally could absorb before panic made him useful to the wrong people. Teren hated that he understood the logic. He hated more that he trusted it. Across the observatory, Ambassador Thorne adjusted the fall of her sleeve. A meaningless gesture unless one had already seen too much. In the mirrored curve of the eastern glass, Mercer gave the smallest possible nod. The sanctuary lights dimmed by 1 degree. Not enough to alarm the room. Enough for systems handoff. This time others noticed. Conversation thinned. The service staff froze for a heartbeat before resuming motion, which meant new instructions had just reached them through internal channel. Somewhere beneath the observatory, sealed mechanisms were waking. Teren's tablet flashed again. Observatory guests are requested to remain in place for brief environmental stabilization. No threat condition. Please continue normal engagement. Mercer closed his eyes once, as if confirming the last comfortable possibility had just been buried. Teren, he said, and hearing his own name without title from the human felt strangely intimate and dangerous. In the next 2 minutes you are going to watch several very competent people try to preserve order by making the single worst assumption available to them. Teren forced his voice steady. Which assumption? Mercer turned toward the storm-veined world below, though his attention was clearly elsewhere now, listening past the room. That because no one is firing yet, he said. This is still a negotiation. The room broke in ways too refined to look like breaking. No screams. No stampede. No single catastrophic moment dramatic enough to give everyone permission to call the danger by its true name. Instead, the observatory shifted by degrees as trained officials tried to preserve civilization through posture. Senior delegates straightened. Aides moved closer to principals without appearing to do so. 2 security liaisons at the northern arch exchanged a glance that lasted half a beat too long, then chose not to draw weapons because the absence of visible violence still offered procedure one last chance to pretend it was in command. Teren watched the coalition do what old institutions always did at the edge of the unthinkable. It interpreted the first impossible evidence in the safest available way. A systems problem. Coercive display. An unauthorized pressure tactic meant to influence the final review. Something political. Something containable. Anything except the harder truth already moving beneath the sanctuary floor. The next signal came from below rather than above. Teren felt it through the polished stone before he heard it. A low mechanical tremor rolling upward through the observatory supports with the slow inevitability of a buried machine changing purpose. Several glasses on passing trays rattled against their metal rings. The music stopped mid-phrase. This time everyone noticed. The sanctuary's voice followed a breath later, calm and sexless and catastrophically composed. Internal transit restricted. Atmospheric partitions active. Summit personnel are advised to remain in designated hospitality sectors pending command review. A pause followed, short enough to sound procedural and long enough to feel measured. No one in the room spoke first. Then half a dozen conversations started at once, all too controlled. Ministers demanded clarification in tones designed to avoid infecting the chamber with panic. 2 junior delegates attempted to leave through the western colonnade and found the corridor sealed by a transparent partition that had not been there 10 seconds earlier. Someone laughed once, sharply and involuntarily, the sound of a nervous system arriving at a conclusion the mind had not agreed to. Across the observatory, the humans did not cluster. They became still, not frozen, focused. Ambassador Thorne turned from her ministers with no visible urgency and crossed toward the center of the chamber as though seeking better acoustics. 2 members of her delegation drifted apart instead of together, one angling toward the service alcoves, another toward the eastern viewing arc. Mercer stayed where he was for exactly 1 heartbeat more, then took Teren by the forearm with unceremonious pressure. "Walk," he said. Teren nearly pulled free on reflex. "To where?" "The place you'll be least useful to them." "To who?" But Mercer was already moving, steering him not toward an exit, which would have drawn attention, but into the gathering crowd near the central sculpture ring where frightened officials were converging in search of visibility, rank, and instruction. It was a brilliant choice and infuriating for that reason. The Coalition would protect the space longest because it contained witnesses, symbols, and people important enough to destabilize sectors if mishandled. Safety through political value. Humanity had predicted institutional instinct and positioned accordingly. "They're taking control from inside the sanctuary," Teren said, keeping pace. "How?" Mercer's answer came without hesitation. "By borrowing authority faster than your people can challenge it." "That is not an answer. It is the only one you can use in the next 60 seconds. They reached the sculpture ring as Summit Command finally joined the room in person. Director Malvek appeared on the raised mezzanine above the observatory floor, flanked by 2 sanctuary guards and lit from beneath by the pale glow of emergency strips. He looked exactly as authority should look during instability. Composed, visible, faintly offended by disorder. Teren had worked under him twice before. Malvek was careful, proud of his refusal to panic, loyal to protocol in the sincere and dangerous way of men who believed order could be restored if named convincingly enough. "Delegates," Malvek said, his amplified voice carrying cleanly through the chamber. "There is no active threat condition. We are managing an internal systems conflict triggered by unauthorized data interference within lower command architecture. The sanctuary remains secure. You will remain in place while technical containment teams restore normal function." A murmur spread, muted but immediate. Some of the tension eased. Teren felt rather than saw Mercer's reaction beside him. Not surprise. Confirmation. Malvek continued. "Preliminary evidence suggests external actors attempted to falsify perimeter telemetry during the admission proceedings. We are assessing whether Summit data streams were manipulated to induce instability. Until verification is complete, all delegates are requested to disregard unconfirmed sensor reports and comply with." Ambassador Thorne interrupted him. She did it gently, almost apologetically, which made the interruption more devastating than force would have. "Director," she said, her voice unamplified and still somehow reaching the room, "if you continue describing this as a data event, you are going to hand operational advantage to the people who are already inside your command spine." Every head in the observatory turned toward her. Malvek's face did not change, but the muscles along his jaw hardened into discipline. "This is neither the forum nor the time," he began. "It is exactly the time," Thorne said. "There are hostile assets in your sanctuary systems. They are using your continuity protocols to slow recognition, isolate your security tiers, and keep this room compliant until they decide whether compliance is sufficient." The silence after that statement had weight. Real weight. Not absence of sound, but the collapse of a shared lie. Malvek recovered first. "Ambassador, if your delegation has introduced unverifiable threat claims into an unstable environment," Mercer muttered, almost to himself. "There it is." Teren turned sharply. "What?" "The dangerous assumption," Mercer said. "He still thinks this can be controlled by narrating it first. On the mezzanine, one of Malvek's guards raised a hand to his earpiece. Then he stiffened. A second later, the guard beside him did the same. Neither lowered their hands. Neither spoke. Teren saw the change before most others did. Not alarm, but interruption. Command input severed. Remote channel overwritten. The lights cut hard. Not to darkness. To emergency geometry. White illumination vanished, replaced by strips of cold red tracing the floor, the railings, the seams of the chamber doors. The crystal dome above the observatory dimmed to a mirrored black in which the delegates could now see themselves more clearly than the stormlit world below. A collective sound moved through the room. Not yet panic, but the first inhalation before it. Then the sanctuary spoke again, and this time the voice was not neutral. Continuity lock acknowledged, it said. Witness sectors isolated. Priority retrieval in progress. Someone near the rear gasped, "That isn't the sanctuary voice." No, Teren thought. It wasn't. The tone had been altered only slightly, but enough to make obedience feel like capture. The first actual violence came so fast it barely counted as an event before it became consequence. The transparent partition at the western colonnade went opaque, then dark, then exploded inward in a spray of crystalline shards as a body hit it from the far side. A sanctuary technician tumbled into view, skidding across the polished floor with blood already bright on his uniform. Behind the ruined barrier stood two figures in command gray composite armor bearing sanctuary insignia that took Teren half a second to recognize as wrong. Correct shape, incorrect proportions. Authority copied by people certain no one present would notice until too late. Security finally moved. Coalition guards drew and advanced. One armored intruder raised a hand and projected something across the floor. Not a blast, not a projectile, but a fan of interference that turned every active badge, tablet, and local comm unit in the western half of the chamber into dead metal. The guards stumbled mid-command, coordination severed before a single formal order completed. Mercer's hand slammed between Teren's shoulders and drove him down just as a concussive round shattered the sculpture pedestal where they had been standing. Stone and light burst outward. The observatory erupted. This time people screamed. Not everyone. The humans did not. Thorne was already moving, not away from the breach but diagonally across the chamber toward the central control plinth built into the sculpture ring. One of her delegates vaulted a fallen service cart and sent glass, silver, and hot liquid skidding across the floor directly into the path of an advancing armored figure. Another human seized a ceremonial banner pole, not as a weapon at first, but as a lever to wrench open a jammed access seam hidden in the base of the eastern wall. They had mapped the room in advance. Not because they expected this exact attack, Teren realized, but because they expected any room containing power to eventually need a second shape. A coalition guard went down beside him, shoulder burned through by a pulse strike meant for someone more important. Teren grabbed the guard's sidearm without thinking, then froze because thought returned all at once. He was an analyst with a weapon in a diplomatic observatory under hostile systems control, while the first contact species moved like they had already rehearsed the failure of peace. Every available conclusion contradicted something he had believed about the day, the summit, or civilization itself. Mercer crouched beside the broken pedestal, breathing evenly. There was blood on one sleeve that did not appear to be his. "You wanted the answer," he said. Teren stared at him. "This is your answer?" Mercer's gaze flicked toward Thorne, who had reached the control plinth and was manually tearing away its upper casing with help from a Keeler delegate. Teren would never have expected to hold position under fire. "No," Mercer said. "This is the part we hoped you would never have to see." Another impact rattled the chamber. Above them the mirrored dome brightened, not with lightning from the dead world below, but with movement in orbit. Shapes, vast, mute, shield-shadowed shapes sliding across reflected starlight. The hidden fleet was no longer hiding, and in that merciless red light, while the sanctuary tore itself into sectors and the first armed retrieval team pressed inward, Teren understood the major twist too late for it to be comforting. Humanity had not come to Orith Prime simply to join the coalition. They had come expecting someone to try and stop them. The realization did not simplify anything. It made everything worse in the way truth often did when it arrived complete. Humanity had walked into Orith Prime smiling, speaking of trust and shared futures, while quietly preparing for the possibility that the invitation itself was bait. Not because they wanted a fight. Teren saw that clearly now. Nothing in the humans' movements carried the thrill of vindication or the recklessness of prophecy fulfilled. They moved like people executing the least terrible branch of a plan they had hoped to avoid. That distinction should have comforted him. It did not. It only made the room feel smaller, because restraint of that kind implied long practice. The retrieval team pressed through the western breach with disciplined speed, but their momentum died faster than Teren expected. The observatory had been designed as a ceremonial space, not a fortress, yet ceremony had its own geometry. Pillars blocked clean lines of fire. Reflective surfaces corrupted targeting angles. Curved floor levels created blind shifts in elevation. The attackers had counted on paralysis. What they found instead was interruption. Ambassador Thorne had already torn the central plinth open and exposed a mesh of sanctuary access fibers beneath the decorative shell. She knelt in formal diplomatic robes with her sleeves pushed back, fingers inside a control spine older than some member worlds, and directed 3 people at once without ever raising her voice. One human delegate pulled power relays by hand. The Keeler archivist Mercer had charmed earlier lay flat opposite the plinth, passing crystal memory tabs into exposed slots with trembling but accurate claws. A coalition minister held a fallen guard's sidearm and watched the eastern approach with the stunned concentration of someone who had never expected to become part of the sentence she was currently living through. Teren rose into a crouch behind the shattered pedestal and fired once, more from instinct than confidence. The shot struck composite armor and did little beyond turning one attacker's attention toward him. Mercer yanked him sideways a fraction before a pulse round burned across the pedestal rim where his head had been. Stone hissed. The air smelled like ionized dust and hot metal. "You are very bad at this," Mercer said. "I am not a combat officer." "No," Mercer replied, checking the chamber with quick, precise glances. "But tonight you may need to impersonate one." Another blast lit the observatory red-white. Somewhere near the western colonnade a delegate cried out in pain. Somewhere else someone shouted sanctuary command phrases that no longer meant anything because the systems hearing them were no longer loyal. Teren forced himself to breathe through the chaos and followed Mercer's gaze. The assault had structure. 2 armored teams inside. One still outside the breach holding the line. No indiscriminate slaughter yet. That detail mattered. "They are not here to kill the room," Teren said. Mercer's eyes flicked to him, sharp with approval. "Good. Keep going." "Witness sectors," Teren said, mind racing backward through the stolen sanctuary announcement. "Priority retrieval. They need specific people alive." "Yes. Which ones?" Thorne answered without looking up. "The humans if possible. Anyone who saw the orbital data if necessary. And anyone senior enough to authenticate the wrong version of what happens next." The scale of it landed all at once. Not just a sabotage operation. Not just an assassination attempt. A replacement event. Remove the right people, pressure the right survivors, release the right explanation, and history itself could be bent before morning. The attack was not merely violence. It was narrative engineering with bodies. A chime sounded from inside the plinth. Thorne looked up. "I have partial architecture," she said. "Not command. Enough to open and close. Not enough to own." "Can you get us out?" Mercer asked. "Not all at once." A concussive round slammed into the sculpture ring and split polished stone into glittering shards. The Keeler archivist flinched but did not abandon the slot interface. Mercer rose just high enough to fire twice in measured succession, forcing the Western team behind cover. He was no longer using a formal sidearm. Teren had not seen when he acquired the compact pulse weapon in his left hand. Of course he had not. The human had been carrying secondary intentions since the moment they met. The observatory doors on the southern side unlocked with a heavy internal thunk. Half the room turned toward the sound in reflexive hope. That reflex nearly killed them. Through the widening seam came not rescue but a second armored pair and a hovering drone node projecting a dampening field that made every surviving display in the chamber stutter to black. One of the intruders broadcast a command over local audio in perfect sanctuary protocol cadence. Stand down. Witness sorting in progress. Remain visible and unarmed. The trick was almost elegant. Use institutional language during violence and frightened people will obey for 3 extra seconds. 3 seconds was enough. 2 delegates near the south door raised their hands and were immediately dropped by restraint bolts that cocooned their arms in crackling bands. Mercer swore under his breath. That route's gone. Thorne looked across the chamber at him. Nothing dramatic passed between them, just assessment at speed. Then she said, "Then we stop trying to leave like guests." She struck the plinth with the heel of her palm. Deep within the observatory, hidden mechanisms answered. The eastern viewing arc darkened completely. The service alcoves sealed. Emergency shutters began descending not over exits, but across interior partitions, slicing the diplomatic chamber into narrower tactical lanes. The attackers noticed too late. One armored figure tried to cross the central floor and found his path abruptly divided by a descending crystal slab. Another turned toward the plinth and fired, but the shot hit a moving barrier edge and scattered into harmless light. "What did you do?" Teren asked. "Restored the sanctuary's older instincts," Thorne said. "Before it became ceremonial, it was built to compartmentalize." The sentence hit him like a second education. Of course it had. Coalition spaces loved to disguise their teeth as architecture. Somewhere in the long centuries of stability, everyone had begun treating those teeth as decorative. The humans apparently had read deeper. The violence changed shape. The attackers had entered expecting one large room full of dignitaries. Now they were being broken apart into smaller engagements inside a machine whose partitions no longer obeyed them. Panic did not vanish, but it localized. This mattered. Fear in one large room became chaos. Fear in several smaller spaces sometimes became choice. Teren found himself shoved into such a choice almost immediately. A southern restraint drone swung around the edge of a partition and targeted the minister beside the plinth. Teren fired first this time, not well but fast enough. The shot clipped the drone's stabilizer array and sent it veering into a pillar, where it burst in a spray of sparks. The minister looked at him with open astonishment. Teren did not feel brave. He felt as though the entire universe had become too absurd for terror to keep pace. Above the observatory, the black dome brightened again. Not reflections this time. Descent signatures. Smaller craft peeling away from the shield-muted shapes in orbit, falling toward sanctuary docking vectors under falsified clearance tags. More were coming. Mercer saw it too. "They've moved to Phase 2. "How many phases are there?" Teren asked. Mercer's mouth tightened. "Too many." At the plinth, the mesh controls flashed amber, then white. Thorne stilled. Every nearby human looked at her at once. She had found something. Teren crossed the broken floor toward her as another partition dropped behind him and cut off the western breach. The sounds of fighting continued beyond the crystal, muted now like violence happening underwater. "What is it?" Mercer asked. Thorne's hands hovered over the exposed fibers without touching them. For the first time that night, something like anger sharpened her composure. "They're not just overriding sanctuary systems. They're piggybacking a Coalition witness archive packet." Teren went cold. "To do what?" "To certify the false record the moment retrieval completes." She looked up at him. "If enough authorized biosigns remain under their control, the official summit history will state that Earth's delegation introduced hidden military assets into admission proceedings and attempted coercive entry under threat of orbital force." The room seemed to contract around the idea. The minister swore softly. The Keeler archivist made a small strangled sound. Teren felt not fear but insult so profound it bordered on nausea. They were not simply being attacked. They were being used to manufacture the moral shape of the attack itself. "And if they get that record out first?" he asked. "Then every defensive action humanity takes after tonight becomes proof of the lie," Thorne said. "That is the trap." For one brutal second the chamber had no answer. Then Teren understood his own relevance. Not as a shooter, not as a survivor, as an analyst. He had spent his career reading institutional logic from inside. He knew where coalition systems placed trust, how continuity layers verified sequence, how false records were stabilized when panic tempted administrators to accept the first coherent version available. They need command authority and event continuity markers, he said, already leaning over the plinth. Not just living witnesses. They need timestamp integrity anchored to summit behavioral logs. My credentials can access the cross-species assessment archive. Mercer stared at him. Can you break it? No, Teren said, mind outrunning fear now. But I can poison certainty. That got Thorne's full attention. Explain. The coalition doesn't trust raw testimony during instability. It trusts contradiction clusters. If I inject authenticated doubt into the behavioral archive before their witness packet locks, the system will flag the event as compromised and suspend legal finalization pending multi-source review. The minister blinked. You can do that? Teren met her gaze. I can make the truth impossible to bury quickly. Mercer gave one short breath that might have been a laugh in another life. Humans aren't the only species that prepare for ugly things. No, Teren said, reaching into the plinth interface. We're just usually less honest about it. The work became its own battle. He patched his tablet directly into the exposed sanctuary fibers while Thorne rerouted power around dead channels and the Keeler archivist fed memory tabs into the older architecture. Mercer and the remaining guards held the narrowing approaches as impacts echoed from beyond the partitions. Teren ignored everything except sequence. Pull ceremony logs. Anchor initial anomaly timestamp. Correlate lower sensor spine revisions. Insert summit continuity objections under analyst emergency review. Flag command inconsistency between first and second sanctuary voiceprint. Package as unresolved hostile systems interference. He was not proving the full truth. There was no time for that. He was doing something almost as important, making a clean lie impossible. A warning flashed across the plinth. External docking breach imminent. Thorne saw it and made her choice instantly. Once the contradiction packet launches, the plinth hard burns. That kills local control. Mercer glanced back from the approach. Can you send it remotely? No. Then do it. The words landed harder because no one dramatized them. No heroic tone. No ceremonial sacrifice. Just time, consequence, and the discipline to spend both correctly. Teren pushed the final authentication layer through with his own credentials and felt the system accept him. Around the observatory, the older sanctuary architecture responded like a waking animal. Archived emergency relays opened across coalition channels. The contradiction cluster packet began climbing into protected oversight bands where it could not be quietly deleted without leaving scars. Teren saw the progress bar and understood at once what Thorne had already known. The transmit sequence would complete only if someone held the plinth manually through the burn surge. Once initiated, the interface chamber would flash cook. I can maintain it, he said. Mercer turned so sharply it was almost violent. No, you're more useful mobile, Teren snapped, surprising himself with the force in his own voice. You know that. Thorne's eyes met his. In them he saw no gratitude, which strangely steadied him more than gratitude would have. Only judgment, measurement, respect if earned, not gifted. You understand what this does, she said. Yes. It doesn't save this room. I know. It may not save your reputation either. That, more than anything, felt like an invitation into the deepest human logic he had witnessed all night. Truth first. Comfort later, if ever. Teren straightened. Beyond the partition, a heavy impact shook the frame. The next team was already at the door. Go, he said. Take the surviving delegates through whatever path you opened. Get the real witnesses out before the false one locks. Mercer hesitated for the first time since the attack began. It lasted less than a heartbeat and changed Teren's understanding of him more than all the charm from earlier. Beneath the lightness, beneath the prepared competence, there had always been this too. The cost of leaving anyone behind. Then Mercer nodded once. Thorne triggered the burn sequence. The plinth screamed to life beneath Teren's hands. Not metaphorically. Metal actually screamed as current surged through forgotten emergency channels, and every exposed fiber in the chamber turned white-hot at the edges. The contradiction packet climbed through relay bands. 8%. 15. 28. The observatory around him became a series of jagged snapshots. Mercer dragging the wounded minister toward the eastern seam, the Keeler archivist half carrying another delegate through a service aperture that should not have existed. Thorne pausing only long enough to place a small paper notebook beside Teren's tablet on the plinth, as if anchoring one kind of record beside another. Then she was gone. The outer partition blew inward. Armored retrieval operatives stormed through smoke and crystal dust just as the sanctuary's older compartmentalization finished its final act. The floor between Teren and the breach dropped in segmented bands, turning the central ring into an island surrounded by exposed service depth. The attackers skidded to a halt, forced to reroute while their command feed filled with contradiction flags and authority suspensions blooming across Coalition oversight channels. 46%. 62. 74. One operative raised a weapon and fired across the gap. The shot struck the plinth casing and sent molten fragments across Teren's shoulder. Pain arrived late and uselessly. He kept his hands where they needed to be. Another operative shouted for him to terminate the transmission. Another promised survival if he complied. The offers barely registered. He had spent his whole life reading when language was meant to save and when it was meant to erase. Tonight there was no ambiguity left. 91%. Through the black dome above, the shield-muted ships in orbit shifted formation. Not advancing now. Withdrawing. Fast. Somewhere in the sanctuary the official lie had begun collapsing under its own contradictions, and whoever commanded the retrieval operation had decided the window for a clean narrative was closing. 98. The plinth ruptured under his palms. White heat tore upward through the interface chamber, flooding his vision, burning away sound, and for one impossible instant all Teren saw was reflected glass and stormlight and the tiny paper notebook Thorne had left beside his hand beginning to char at the edges. Then the contradiction packet launched. The next thing he knew was air. Cold air. Real air moving across his face. He coughed, tasted blood and ozone, and opened his eyes to unfamiliar geometry. A maintenance transit cradle. Narrow. Dark. In motion. Mercer was kneeling beside him. One hand braced against the wall as the cradle shot through an access tube beneath the sanctuary. The minister was strapped opposite, unconscious but alive. Thorne sat near the hatch with soot across one cheek and a pulse weapon resting loose in her hand. The paper notebook lay in her lap, blackened at one corner and otherwise intact. Teren stared at her. "I thought. You almost died usefully," Mercer said. "Try not to sound disappointed." Confusion fought through the fog in his skull. The plinth had an emergency ejection protocol in its older architecture, Thorne said. "We restored the sanctuary's memory, remember? The absurdity of it nearly broke him. He laughed once, then winced because laughing hurt. Was that part of the plan? No, Thorne said. And for the first time all night her composure cracked into something warmer and exhausted. That was the part where we got lucky. The cradle burst from the access tube into a lower docking vault where coalition guards, actual guards this time, were already securing survivors under the command of officers whose channels had received the contradiction packet before the false witness archive could lock. The scene was chaos, but honest chaos now. Orders collided. Medics ran. Data screamed across open networks. Above all of it, one truth had become irreversible. The official record was contaminated, contested, and impossible to settle quietly. The hidden fleet fled orbit within the hour. Not all of it escaped. Coalition interceptors, late but finally unconfused, crippled 2 shield-muted vessels before they cleared the far shadow. Boarding teams found falsified sanctuary insignia, ghost command keys, and enough covert architecture to prove collusion even before the deeper investigations began. It was not total justice. Clean justice almost never arrived on the same night as blood. But it was enough to stop the lie from hardening into history. The real consequences unfolded more slowly and cut more deeply. Oversight councils opened emergency inquiry chambers across 7-member worlds. Summit admission protocols were suspended, rewritten, then suspended again when investigators discovered how many older continuity systems had been treated as ceremonial rather than operational. Director Malvek survived the night and submitted his resignation 3 days later, not because he had betrayed the sanctuary, but because his need to preserve order had nearly delivered it to those who had. Some judged him harshly. Teren did not. Institutions trained their people to believe stability could always be narrated back into existence. Malvek had simply believed that lesson one crisis too long. As for humanity, the political effects were stranger than outrage alone. Fear rose first. It always did. The image of a newly admitted species arriving under the shadow of hidden orbital assets could have poisoned every argument Earth had made. Instead, the contradiction packet, the recovered docking data, and the sanctuary voiceprint analysis forced a more difficult conclusion into public view. The humans had not hidden power in order to coerce admission. They had hidden protection because someone had already decided admission was dangerous enough to sabotage. That nuance mattered. More than that, it lingered. Across the coalition, people talked not only about the attack but about the way the humans had behaved before and during it. How calmly they had accepted hospitality while preparing for treachery without provoking it. How precisely they had shifted from diplomats to survivors without becoming monsters. How Ambassador Thorne had tried until the final possible moment to preserve both the summit and the truth. And beneath all of that, like a current moving under brighter water, another recognition spread more quietly and more powerfully. Humanity's strength had not been the fleet beyond the sensor veil. It had been the discipline to bring it and still hope not to need it. 3 weeks later, Teren stood once more beneath the repaired crystal dome. Though repaired was the wrong word for what the sanctuary had become. The fractures were gone. The architecture gleamed. Yet everyone who entered moved differently now, as if beauty had been reclassified as something that could no longer be trusted to remain harmless. He understood the feeling. A new session was convening. Smaller, sharper, less ceremonial. Ambassador Thorne stood at the far side of the chamber reviewing a data slate with 2 coalition legal clerks. Mercer leaned nearby in conversation with the same Keeler archivist from the reception, who was now telling some story vivid enough to make the human laugh openly. The sound reached Teren across the polished floor and did something strange to the memory of the night. It did not soften it. It made survival feel real. Mercer noticed him first, naturally. He said something to the archivist, then crossed the chamber with that same infuriatingly relaxed stride Teren now understood as partly genuine and partly chosen for everyone else's benefit. "You lived," Mercer said. "So did you. Professional habit." Teren looked past him toward the dome. The inquiry boards released the final interim summary this morning. "I saw. They used my contradiction framework as the anchor model for future contested event audits." Mercer's mouth curved. "Congratulations. You've improved civilization through paperwork. That is a very coalition way to be heroic." Teren might once have objected to the word. Now he only let it pass. "Your ambassador requested me for the joint security review." Mercer lifted a brow. And I have not decided whether that is a compliment or a burden." "It can be both," Mercer said. "Humans are very fond of that category." Teren studied him for a moment, then asked the question that had waited beneath everything since the observatory. "When did you know the attack was coming?" Mercer's gaze shifted upward to the dome where stormlight drifted in pale ribbons across restored crystal. "We didn't know," he said at last. "We knew the possibility had survived long enough to deserve respect." Teren absorbed that in silence. Respect the possibility. Not paranoia. Not cynicism. Not fear ruling every room. Just a refusal to let hope excuse unreadiness. He thought of human history files, of peace built without forgetting cost, of friendliness preserved not by innocence but by preparation. The lesson still unsettled him. It also felt increasingly like wisdom civilization should have learned earlier. Below them, the chamber doors opened for the new session. Delegates began to enter. Not one of them moved through the sanctuary with the careless trust of before. That, Teren suspected, was the true line history would draw through the event. Not merely that a conspiracy had failed or that a summit had survived, but that an old coalition had been forced to confront the distance between stability and complacency. Mercer started toward the chamber, then paused. "One more thing," he said. Teren waited. "The fleet never crossed the final threshold." "I know," Mercer nodded. "A lot of people keep forgetting that part." Then he walked away beneath the crystal dome toward the next negotiation, leaving Teren with the full, difficult shape of what humanity had made impossible to ignore. They had come in peace. They had prepared for betrayal. They had fought only when there was no honest alternative. And when the night finally demanded proof of what they were, their power had felt neither accidental nor theatrical. It had felt earned.